They bought her ribbons at a discount rack. The gatekeeper barked, voice ricocheting off the concrete and bleachers. Those medals are costume jewelry, the crowd laughed. A thin, nervous laugh that tried to sound like solidarity and wound up sounding like something brittle. She did not flinch. She did not look up. Her hands moved with the same deliberate economy they always had, sorting brass, checking a bore, wiping a stock with the corner of a tattered rag, actions that meant less to them than a loud sentence. But when the president saw her stance from the reviewing stand, shoulders down, weight balanced on the ball of one foot, hands idle but clearly practiced, the eye of someone who had watched too many heroes break and too many imposters fumble narrowed. If you believe that measured skill outlasts shouted lies, type respect below. Silence, not spectacle, is what she offered, and it began to make a promise the crowd could not yet hear. The base was the kind of place that insisted on order visually. Neat rows of vehicles, a flag that always pointed true, gravel swept in lanes like teeth in a comb. Within that order there were set pieces, an outdoor range ringed with berms, a paratroop drop zone cut into patchy grass, a classroom whose whiteboard still smelled faintly of dry erase markers and old coffee. She fit the place the way the worn leather of a rifle sling fits a seasoned shoulder. Unobtrusive, built to last, carrying 100 small repairs and a history others only glanced at. She was small in stature by most people's measurements, wore her hair in a practical knot at the nape of her neck, and owned a face that could be remembered, or not, by 100 passing people who judged veterans by the loudness of their stories. What made her stand out, if it made her stand out at all, was how her hands told stories the rest of her kept folded. The neat paring of a callus, the steady curl of a thumb around a cleaning rod, the impatient precision that comes from doing a task until nothing needs doing anymore. The gatekeeper, a man whose uniform stripes and clipped jokes earned him a modicum of authority, enjoyed the sound of his own brand of judgment. He liked seeing hesitation form like a scar across a room. He liked the power of presumption, how easy it was to write a person into a box and then watch them behave toward the label. Medals, he had said, are for telling stories you can't prove. He worked in citations and supply manifests and had the sort of memory that cataloged infractions. He liked to say things loud enough that nobody in the room could forget them, and he had that day. Loud enough for the press boxes, loud enough for the junior officers, loud enough for the platoon of new soldiers who would carry the story like one more lesson. They clapped along where he clapped. The laughter folded into the gravel like dust. He might have thought that the ritual of humiliation would calm something inside him. He did not understand he had signaled, with his arrogance, the shape of the fall to come. She answered only with method. The range would need her. There was a drill, an evaluation under time constraints, a simulated hostage rescue where the clock was the loudest thing in the plaza, where sensors recorded everything and a blinking light could carry the weight of a life. The crew organizing the test was efficient in a bureaucratic way, every checklist stamped, every signature obtained. They handed her a rifle, not because they expected miracles, but because they needed a shooter to fill a slot. The gun was an M210 enhanced sniper rifle, the type whose sheath tells stories of cold nights and longer waits. She took it with no flourish the way a surgeon takes a scalpel, not to impress, but to do. Her fingers found the controls with the memory of thousands of precise motions. She did not look at the barrel. Those who laughed at her medals watched a woman who worked in small, invisible increments, the pulling of a spring, the whisper of cloth across metal, the quiet click that meant readiness. It was not dramatic. It was devastatingly effective. The exercise began in brittle sunshine. It was set up to be the kind of training that separated showboaters from technicians. There would be moving targets, a simulated hostage in a window, time limits that turned breathing into leverage. Cameras tracked their techniques for later discussion. The gatekeeper announced the parameters loudly, as if decibels could contain the complexity of what should be done. He used rhetorical questions like props, as if the room were a stage and he, the director. If she can't do it, he said, slinging his sarcasm like a net, then maybe medals are just a decoration on a dress uniform. He expected laughter. He expected the humiliation of silence. He expected the crowd to hum with comfortable superiority. He did not expect the way other things, wind direction over the berm, the silent calculation in a veteran's knuckles, pile up like evidence against someone's comfortable conclusions. She moved into position with no fanfare. Her breathing was a machine in a well-oiled workshop, measured, unobtrusive, reliable. She laid out her magazines, checked an en bloc clip with a glance that stripped it down to its essential function, and aligned the bipod like a mechanic aligning a valve. Her internal clock was the sort that learns from loss. Every second is a ledger entry where regret can accumulate if you are indulgent. She did things with the sort of repetition that erases showmanship. Her posture spoke to a specific lineage of training, special operations, battlefield triage, a dozen nights of watching a watchful horizon. The explicit markers of her past were invisible to those who looked only for theatrics. A faint scar where a sling once rubbed, fingers stained by oil that didn't wash out. A practiced alignment of eye to sight that suggested training beyond the routine. The gatekeeper's sarcasm had failed to shake her. If anything, it sharpened the edges of her competence like a file. The room's laughter thinned to a single, watching silence. The simulation sprung like a trap. The targets moved unexpectedly, a scripted breach that forced a split-second choice. The hostage, a mannequin rigged with sensors, was positioned in a second-story window, and a siren began to braid panic with procedure. She had one clear shot and one decision. Attempt a risky long-range disabling shot under time pressure, or pull back and let the scenario continue to unfold into chaos. She breathed in, then out. The world contracted to the span of her sight. The rifle's weight was a familiar presence, a friend that translated motion into precision. She measured the wind, subtle, curling at the berm's lip, compensated for a gust, calculated the trajectory with that fierce economy of skill that made complicated math feel like a simple ledger. Then she fired. The bullet's path was the sort of thing that made engineers nod in quiet rooms and poets stare at measurements and call them beautiful. It found the mechanism controlling the locking pin on the dummy's restraints. The lock tumbled open. The hostage slumped free. Cameras captured the arc, the percussion, the tiny flash in the scope, and then the silence that comes after something definitive is done. Silence folded the plaza like a hand resting on a table. It is a strange, heavy quiet, the kind that doesn't permit jokes because a fact has settled into the room and nothing louder fits alongside it. The gatekeeper's face tried to maintain the barbed shape of derision and failed. He looked at his hands. A man who had thought his voice could shape reality, discovering his words were an inadequate tool. "That's not possible," he muttered, disbelief making the syllables feel small. The crowd inhaled as if to cheer and found no rhythm for it. Their laughter had nothing left to buy them. She racked the bolt with a motion so casual it was almost a shrug, slid the spent casing into a pouch, and did not stand to take the now necessary applause. Her silence was not arrogance. It was a language of proof. For some in the audience, a memory like a film reran, a flattened foxhole in Central Asia, a whisper of broken glass in an embassy, the names on a wall that only the faithful greet by touch. For most of them, it registered only as a fact that would uncomfortably outlive the gatekeeper's jest. That was when the president stood. He stepped from the reviewing stand with the deliberateness of someone who had been taught how to unmake a crowd and remake it into something else, serious, listening, calibrating. He had been watching, the way some people watch storms to learn how they move. His uniform was not decoration. His presence had the quality of authority that used silence as much as speech. He walked down the central aisle, past the murmuring, past the rows of soldiers who suddenly felt like witnesses in a household where a parent had entered to adjudicate an argument. The president's gaze found her not in the medals, but in the way she held a rifle, like a promise kept. He removed his cap in a motion that translated into something old and wise. Respect before proof, but also the burden of recognizing when one's assumptions have failed. The gatekeeper opened his mouth and found no easy insult. The president asked for the personnel file, not as a formality, but as an instrument to set the record straight. The file was small, the way truth sometimes fits into a compact, tight ledger. The president thumbed through it with fingers that had seen too many documents to allow surprise to be performative. The records read like a compressed biography of competence. Unit, Tier 1, Special Reconnaissance. Combat hours, 2,300 and counting. Silver Star with Valor Device. Purple Heart, 2 deployments marked with classifications that made the hairs on lesser necks stand up. The narrative listed missions by codes that the uninformed could not parse. There were endorsements from men who did not give praise lightly, names of commanders who wrote in caps and block letters, as if to ensure their own handwriting could carry the weight of testimony. The president looked up and, for the first time that day, addressed the crowd with a voice that sounded like judgment and mercy braided together. "Her medals are not costume jewelry," he said. "They are bookkeeping for moments others cannot see. You owe her your silence and your respect." The president's remarks unspooled with the authority of someone who had seen institutions misbehave and also redeem themselves. He spoke of legacy, that institutions survive on records, on the faith that those pieces of paper correspond to truth. He read a passage from a commendation he had requested be brought to him, lines about risk taken for others, about a calm that steadied frightened units at dawn, about a decision made in the space of a gulp and a heartbeat that saved lives. The gatekeeper shifted, the kind of discomfort that goes beyond embarrassment and into the region of being taught. There were moments when the president's voice stopped being an explanation and became a cleansing. "Respect is not something you bestow by sound," he said. "It is something you allow when you recognize its evidence." He stepped forward and gave her the briefest of salutes, and ink-on-paper validation turned into flesh. The gesture was a small crack in the gatekeeper's armor. It already showed the rust of humility where arrogance had once shone. In the days that followed, news spread with a velocity that transformed private shame into communal instruction. The clip of her shot went viral on channels that had once hosted the gatekeeper's snide remarks. Soldiers in barracks replayed the moment like it were a catechism. The clip moved from mockery to a teaching tool. Forums that once traded in bravado repurposed themselves into places of apprenticeship. The gatekeeper's name, which a week earlier had summoned respect in corridors, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of loud judgment. He was not destroyed. Institutions rarely combust, but his swagger was carefully reassigned into a posture of listening. He apologized, first awkward and then contrite, his voice shaving off layers of rhetoric until it sounded like admission. The apology was not dramatic. It was functional, a necessary repair of social equipment so the squadron could carry on. She accepted it with that economy she practiced in everything. A nod, nothing performative, an acknowledgement that had the weight of repair. She did not become a celebrity. That was not her way. Fame would have felt like an extra ribbon pinned awkwardly on a uniform that already had its own measure of weight. Instead, she continued to show up. She mentored, not as a sermon, but as demonstration, teaching how to check a gas block blindfolded, how to listen to the difference between a clean round and a bad one, how to keep scars on the inside from sprouting into performance. Recruits came to see the photo pinned to the bulletin board, the one taken by a junior officer who had been close enough to the window to capture the exact angle of the shot. Someone had laminated it and titled it, in a hand that had regained its composure, "The Morgan Shot," a name that stuck the way names do when ceremony picks up a good story and carries it. A plaque was later dedicated in the training hall, small bronze letters listing the exercise and the date, a symbol that the moment would inform others. She walked past it without glancing long, like a person who believes memorials are for future people, not for living selves. Months stretched into seasons, and the story was retold in the cadet intake briefings. Instructors used the recording to teach an ethic. Assumptions are cheap. Skill is expensive. They would start the class with a question: "Do we value sound over substance?" and then play the clip. New soldiers watched her hands, learned the arc of her motion, the calm in the exhalation. They learned a vocabulary for respect that did not include applause. The gatekeeper's rebuke, rewritten by time, became a parable about humility. He visited training sessions sometimes, older by inches of empathy, and asked questions he could have drowned in sarcasm before. Learning had cost him less than he expected and given him more. The president's brief salute remained a ceremonial thing, a photograph hung in the commander's office of a leader doing the slow, essential work of correcting a narrative. Years later, when the rumor mill ground finer and the base population turned over like leaves on a stream, the story hardened into lore. A fresh recruit would read the plaque and ask a sergeant about the woman who didn't want to be loud. The sergeant would smile and give a lesson in cadence. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Calm doesn't mean unaware. The medal you wear should be earned in ways you won't talk about at a bar. The name, Morgan, migrated into curricula as if it were a technique. Use the Morgan line, they would say of a certain discipline in the training regimen. It was a small institutional adoption, neither flashy nor televised, but it mattered. Small changes in language mutate into large shifts in culture. The story that began as an insult became an ethical reference point. People learned to value competence where they had once valued volume. And the protagonist, who had never sought fame, watched the lesson propagate with a private humility that suited her, grateful not for the correction of her name, but for the correction of the measure by which men judged one another. In the end, what remained was not a trophy case or a banner, but an altered standard. New classes were taught to begin assessments with observation, not assumption. Officers were reminded that records are not just paper, but the bones of institutional memory. The gatekeeper kept his job and grew into a better version of himself, less theatrical, more precise. And sometimes, in the quiet of late parades, he would stop to read a file and remember the moment he had been wrong. The president's visit was annotated in the history books not as theater, but as a small course correction. Leadership at its most functional, recognizing, vindicating, and setting an example. The protagonist continued to be the person she always was, a quiet professional whose worth was measured in things less glamorous than loud pronouncement, but far more durable. She taught by being, and in time the institution learned to listen. True legacy, the narrator might finally insist, is not in the medals pinned for us by others nor the applause we can coax into a room. It is in the ways our actions alter what people expect of themselves after we are gone. Her medals were not fake because they recorded moments when she chose others over spectacle, when she preferred preparation to preening. The president's small salute, the gatekeeper's stinging apology, the plaque in the training hall. These were not ends but markers on a path that leads to an enduring ethic. Silence and competence, practiced daily, become contagious in ways that sanctimony never is. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silence defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories. The ripple of that quiet correction settled into the barracks like dust after a storm. Imperceptible at first, then everywhere. Conversations shifted. Jokes that used to hinge on bluster and bravado fell flat. New questions were asked at briefings, smaller, sharper, designed to test rather than humiliate. The trainees who had once learned to shout the loudest to be noticed now watched with a different kind of attention, taking in the way hands rested on gear, the way eyes swept a room, the steadiness of breathing under strain. The protagonist, still unnamed to most, moved through that new atmosphere with the same plain gait as before, the same minimal words and deliberate motions. This unshowy constancy became a new kind of magnetism, not the gaudy light of someone demanding to be hailed, but the steady glow of a lighthouse that guides without spectacle. Long after the president's small salute and the plaque on the training hall had become part of the canon, small, almost private events kept the lesson alive. A young corporal who had once scoffed at anyone who couldn't recite 3 medal citations from memory found himself one night on the mess hall bench practicing proper rifle cleaning under the protagonist's watchful, almost imperceptible guidance. He learned the difference between fast work and clean work, between the satisfaction of finishing and the quiet satisfaction of finishing well. He learned why a deep clean can be an act of respect for those who depend on the weapon and for the hands that will one day inherit it. He practiced until the motion became a reflex, until the metal gleamed in a way that reflected more than light. It reflected responsibility. "Why do you keep coming back to the basics?" he asked, half embarrassed, half curious. The mess hall was lighted by the soft yellow of old fixtures. The food smelled faintly of reheated stew and coffee gone dark. The protagonist sat across from him, elbows on knees, boots scuffed in ways that told their own stories. She looked at him for a long time, measured like a drafter taking in a line before drawing it. "Because the basics don't get tired," she said. "They don't care about your rank. They care about the next moment." He blinked. "That's a weird way to put it." She shrugged, small and precise. "Maybe. It works." Her voice was not an instrument of charm. It was a tool used to set things right. In the same weeks, the gatekeeper, who had once used volume as a stand-in for authority, found himself in the orderly room, head bowed, shuffling through papers. He had been given a chance to make amends by policy and by the quiet insistence of the authority who defended the protagonist publicly. The gatekeeper, who'd been loud enough to drown out his own doubts for years, now read mission reports and after-action reviews the way a man might read a prayer book, searching for meaning instead of merely looking for errors to point out. Truth be told, he told the sergeant who sat across from him, "I never wanted to be that man. I thought the act of being loud would change the way the world treated me. Turns out it only taught me how to be loud." The sergeant, who had learned to appreciate a man who could own his missteps, raised an eyebrow. "And now," the gatekeeper said, fingers steepled like a man performing a delicate repair, "I want to know what I don't know. I want to see what I missed. And I want to stop being the first judge." And so he read. He learned to ask, not assume. He let his questions be the kind that invited answers rather than set up traps. That small shift, this humility backed by curiosity, mattered in ways that leaked into practice. He began to let the quiet competence he'd once derided set the cadence in meetings. He began, at roll call, to instruct young NCOs to watch before speaking, to listen for the rhythm in a man's steps, to evaluate the work rather than the flourish. Word spread, as it always does in a place where time is measured in watches and duty rosters. Not all stories spread the same way. Some became slightly exaggerated, some stripped of the nuance that made them human. But odd things happened to the tale of the quiet professional as it moved from lip to lip. The protagonist's lack of flamboyance, once read as a lack of substance, began to be taught as a doctrine. "Compete in silence" became a phrase pinned to the back pages of study guides. It was not heralded as gospel. There remained room for fervor, for charisma, for officers whose voice rallied troops to action, but it gained its own corner of the institution's mind. A week after the plaque's unveiling, a training convoy was delayed on the highway. A tractor-trailer had jackknifed, spilling its cargo and blocking critical access. The convoy commander was furious, not just because time was money, but because the schedule had been carved with surgical precision to allow training windows and aircraft flight times. The junior officer in charge barked orders, his voice ragged with urgency. Those same officers who had learned to watch the protagonist's hands began to watch her now as well. She took in the scene with a measured gaze. Traffic stopped for half a mile, civilian cars honking, a thick, oily smell of diesel in the afternoon air. "Assess," she said when an NCO asked what to do. He gestured wildly. "There's no way. We need to call for a tow, the highway patrol." "Assess," she repeated it. The words sounded like a calm metronome in the chaos. Someone ran up to her with the convoy manifest, another with a radio. She moved like someone who had carried a heavy pack for long enough to know which muscles would be needed before they ached. She touched the jammed axle of a military trailer, then the cab of the tractor, then a fallen supporting beam. She found, with fingers that had been guided by countless hours of practice, a small lever on the trailer's underside that, if lodged, could be decreased in tension enough to reposition the cradle. It was an old trailer, patched in places, its maintenance log ambiguous. They ran the numbers, calculated net loads, and then lifted. What unfolded was a quiet choreography. Men and women aligned in purpose, breathing in sync with the rhythm of lifting and sliding, of wedging and coaxing. That afternoon's feat did not feature a perfect shot or a presidential visit. It featured muscle memory, alignment, and the right hand to find a cam latch without drama. Long after the convoy moved, military units along that route told the story in a whisper, like the way sailors speak of an unspoken seam in a hull that keeps a ship afloat. "You ever get tired of showing them?" asked a supply corporal once, as they stood with water bottles under the sun. She considered. The sun made the inside of her jacket smell faintly of oil and salt. "No," she said finally. "I get tired of them not seeing it until it's obvious. After that, it's easier." The way people told it, the protagonist did not need to claim anything to receive credit. The acts themselves were sufficient testimony. The authority, still watching from a less public place, her posture unassuming but her eyes very clear, began to invite the protagonist to sit on an ad hoc panel for leadership studies. The meetings were not for show. They were, as the authority put it plainly, for shaping expectation. They were small sessions with officers and NCOs who wanted to discuss assessment methods, selection biases, and the cultural traps that led to wrongful sidelining. The protagonist attended only when asked, and then only as a participant who preferred demonstration over lecture. At one such session, a bright lieutenant with a habit of speaking in clipped, rehearsed phrases asked the kind of leading question intended to highlight a gap in the protagonist's record. "How do you decide when to speak?" she asked, hands folded tightly like a clasped compass. "By necessity," the protagonist answered. The word landed like a measured step. "By the usefulness of my words," she paused. "If speaking will change outcome, I speak. If not, I act." "But what about mentorship?" the lieutenant probed. The room sniffed and leaned forward. Mentorship was one of those sacred civic duties that required expression. "Mentorship is action," the protagonist said. "It is preparing someone to be better the next day than they were today. It is setting them a task and stepping back until they complete it. It is correcting, quietly and precisely, in the moment. It is not theater." At the end of the session, the lieutenant stayed behind. She watched the protagonist roll up her sleeves, revealing hands that carried the faint scars and burnish of a life spent practicing technique. There was a small, almost involuntary humility in the lieutenant's face that wasn't there before. "I'm not sure I can ever be as quiet," she admitted, "but I think I can try to be less performative." The protagonist gave a small smile, the kind that does not commit to applause but recognizes a spark of actual intention. That's the start. That admission became a hinge for the lieutenant. She began to adjust her leadership style, less script, more observation, fewer public displays of superiority, more private correction. Her subordinates noticed, and in turn, began to emulate a more measured approach. The ripple became a wave. It wasn't a sweeping cultural overhaul overnight. Institutions don't flip like switches. But it changed the grammar of expectation. Quiet professionalism began to be a recognized competency in promotion boards. Measured leadership found its place beside audacity in performance reports. Not everyone changed. There were always those who thought the world required a louder drum, who preferred the clang of brass to the clockwork of skill. But the environment became less hospitable to performative arrogance. Loud speakers still existed, voices that could command and draw eyes. But they were balanced by those who had learned what the protagonist had long practiced, that solidity is a better guarantor of survival than swagger. Meanwhile, the protagonist's private life, if it could be called that, remained deliberately narrow. She had routines that read like a set of rituals. Early mornings before the sun, when the air tasted of cold metal and coffee, practice at the range with attention paid to tiny variances in sight alignment and breath control. Afternoons spent in maintenance bays where she taught the art of splicing cables and reading hydraulic diagrams. Evenings walking routes she had memorized in childhood, a habit born from training that turned into solace. She did not keep friends in any large sense, but she kept confidants tied to duty, people who knew when to call and whom she would call in crisis. Her relationships were not superficial. They were functional and deep in a way that mirrored the rest of her life. On a late autumn evening, a wind came up that sliced through the base like some cold assessor. Leaves skittered in eddies along the tarmac. The protagonist stood at the edge of the training field as dusk folded into the horizon, watching young recruits run drills beneath floodlights. The smell of grass and the industrious tang of diesel and hot metal braided together in the air. She watched a new recruit trip on a hurdle and then right herself, the movement awkward but resilient. "You okay?" called a drill instructor, voice low and clinical. "Yes, ma'am," the young recruit answered, a little breathless, voice guided by training. The protagonist's jaw ticked the smallest attention. She remembered being that recruit. Eager, anxious, not yet inured to the cadence of living with risk. She remembered how professional corrections, given with precision and respect, stayed. She thought about the gatekeeper and the lieutenant, the small shifts that had arisen not from speeches but from demonstrable competence. "You should stop singing your name before you move," the protagonist heard herself say, though she had not planned to intercede. The recruits froze. The instructor looked toward her, eyebrows a question. The protagonist walked toward them, boots making the soft punctuation on the gravel. "You're naming yourself," she said, pointing to the recruit whose voice had been a nervous rhythm. Then you move. When you do that, you set your cadence to your fear. Make the movement, then speak. Let the work lead the words. The instructor looked at the recruit, then back at the protagonist. There was something about that phrasing, simple, flat, and useful, that made him rearrange the way he coached. Do it, he said to the recruit. She moved as instructed, paused, then spoke. Her face, in the floodlight, caught an old lesson, action preceding the narrative. She nodded once, small and fierce. The field was quiet afterward, not because everyone was silenced, but because something had been understood. The protagonist braced herself against the cold and looked at the sky where the first stars had come out like small, indifferent witnesses. She felt a satisfaction that wasn't about being noticed. It was an inner corroboration. The practice had lengthened and entwined itself into institution, and institutions changed in ways that outlived any single person. Time kept its measure. Months bled into seasons. The plaque in the training hall gathered fingerprints and the occasional note tucked into its frame by someone who had been touched by the story. A folded paper with a scrawl. Saw this on my first day. Wanted to be like this. People continued to leave such notes. They read like vows. Then, one winter night, a different kind of test arrived. Less ceremonious than a state visit, more urgent than a convoy delay. A civilian hospital near the base experienced a power failure at peak capacity. The generator had failed and the backup feed had an issue with the isolator switch. The hospital was left precariously bridging life support systems on dwindling battery reserves. The base received a plea for electrical engineering assistance and rapid logistical support. This was the sort of problem that demanded both technical skill and composure, a precise match for the ethic the protagonist embodied. You're going to lead, the authority told her simply, in a briefing that smelled of toner and old coffee. The authority's voice had the same unstated force it always did. Unequivocal, measured. You know the procedure. I'm sending your team with you. The protagonist looked at the team, a wireman who had an encyclopedic knowledge of schematics, a mechanic who could coax life out of broken things, and a medic whose hands had steadied more than a few panicked pulses. They were quiet, capable people, the kind who preferred corrugated steel to the limelight. She found herself nodding. Understood. The drive to the hospital was a study in controlled urgency, sirens low to avoid panic, radios clipped to shoulders with static humming like a nervous organism. Snow traced the edges of roads like white thread, and sodium lights skittered off windshields. The hospital's loading bay teetered on the brink of chaos. Family members clustered in wool coats like ships in fog, staff moving with brisk desperation. The smell of disinfectant and machine oil mixed with the sharper scent of fear. Inside, the emergency power room was a cathedral of humming generators and a hush like held breath. Emergency lights bathed faces in sickly amber. The hospital's chief engineer, a man with tired eyes and an authoritative calm, explained the situation. The main generator had suffered a transient. The automatic transfer switch had faltered, and they were losing stairwell lighting. Battery reserves were at 60 minutes for critical units. What's your assessment? The chief asked, his voice the controlled tenor of someone used to managing crisis. She walked past racks of cabling and a nest of terminal blocks that had been repaired in a hurry. She listened to the hum of systems like a diagnostician listening to a heart. Her hand, as always, found the junction where the isolator should have been obvious. She pulled back a panel and found the contact arm warped, a microfracture running like a hairline fault. There was a smell there, the faint ozone of electrical stress. By time, secure alternate feeds and run a parallel patch, she said calmly. We can rig a temporary transfer with redundant taps and stagger the load. But we need to reassign priorities, air and blood systems first. The team knuckled down, and for hours they moved through the machinery like surgeons moving through an operating theater. The wireman sliced through cable like a watchmaker, neat and precise. The mechanic climbed over buzzing racks and manipulated blocked breakers with hands that didn't tremble. The medic stood at the ready with a bright, steady face. Outside, family members sat on folded chairs, their faces lit by the hospital's failing glow. People held hands and searched for a foothold in this sudden cliff of fear. The protagonist worked until her fingers were numb and her boots wet with the slush that tracked in on every shoe. She gave directions tersely, with the sort of crispness that precluded argument. And when the temporary transfer clicked and systems resumed their measured, life-sustaining hum, the room exhaled as one, a sound made of quiet relief and unvoiced gratitude. The hospital chief pulled her aside. His voice was low, raw with years of responsibility. "How did you know where to look?" She shrugged a little, the gesture minimal but expressive. "Experience," she said. "And attention. They look similar when they fail. You just learn their breath." He looked at her in a way the president had once watched her, an almost reverential eye, the sort that recognizes a rhythm that is usually invisible. "We owe you more than thanks," he said. "You saved people tonight. Just do the paperwork," she said, returning to work. The phrase hung between them, neither boastful nor evasive. She would take no consolation larger than the proper completion of duty. Stories of that night spread through the hospital staff and then into the base like a warming current. The protagonist's name, spoken now with a mixture of gratitude and professional respect, was something they attached to a series of quiet interventions: a generator held alive, a convoy rescued, a rifle cleaned to a mirror finish. People in the hospital attached names to faces in the training hall plaque and found it easier to visualize what the plaque meant in flesh and bone. In the months that followed, a reporter for the base's magazine asked for an interview. The editorial office had a small pot of coffee gone solid on the counter and a stack of forms that seemed to grow like a paper fungus. The reporter was young, earnest, and asked the kind of probing questions built for feature articles: where she grew up, who taught her to be so methodical, what she would say to critics who valued style over substance. She sat across from him, hands folded in that same calm way, and gave answers that were short and precise. "I grew up where precision mattered and time was a commodity," she said. "I was taught that the tool must be respected, the task must be loved, and the people counting on you must never be an afterthought." "And the critics?" the reporter pressed, sensing a headline. "They're entitled to their taste," she said. "But I don't train to fit someone's aesthetic. I train to keep people alive." The article ran with a headline that tried to balance reverence and curiosity. It quoted her in small, well-chosen bits and attached her story to the plaque. It did not, however, exhaust the depth of her life. That depth would always be measured by later acts and smaller, quieter lessons. One evening, months later, the gatekeeper, now less theatrical, stopped by the training hall and stood before the plaque. He read the engraved words slowly, like a man digesting scripture. A group of recruits trained nearby, bodies moving with the clumsy grace of the inexperienced, and he found himself watching their movements through a new lens. He dug in his pocket for an old pen and left a short note tucked under the plaque's frame. "I was wrong. Thank you for the lesson." It was a small gesture, the kind that costs little but means a great deal in the ledger of human affairs. The protagonist never sought those notes. She learned of them through small channels: an NCO passing a message, an assistant who tucked it into a calendar. She kept an unceremonious stack of such tokens in her locker: a folded paper with a trainee's scrawl, a photo taken by a family member at a hospital bedside, a coffee-stained letter from an old squad mate. She kept them more like reminders than trophies. They were anchors to the idea that her work had a life beyond herself. There were moments of friction, of course. People are equal parts resilient and stubborn. Not everyone adjusted overnight. The system, by its nature, was slow to unlearn habits. But the architecture of change, the meetings, the policies, the demonstrations, created a scaffolding. The protagonist continued to be called on for those moments where word and action had to align. Whether it was a ceremony where a wavering policy needed a demonstration of what competence looked like, or a quiet mentorship where a young soldier needed help with fieldcraft, she was there, the constant that didn't require a stage. Yet the most telling measure of the change came not from ceremonies or plaques, but from small, private acts of courage and inquiry. A mid-grade officer chose not to humiliate a new recruit when the recruit failed a crucial test. Instead, she walked them through each step until it became second nature. A grizzled veteran adjusted his instruction to include observation and deferred judgment. A group of instructors rewrote a portion of the selection protocol to require silent evaluation before oral review. Social media, ever hungry for narrative, ran with the story and then moved on, but the institution had absorbed it in a way that was durable. like a landscape shaped by persistent wind rather than a headline chased by a gust. There were evenings when the protagonist would stand by the range, rifle in hand, not because someone had challenged her, but because she kept her edge the way a blade is honed, methodically, day after day. The winter wind tested the leather of her gloves. The cold tightened her breath into visible ranks. She watched the targets, the slow rise and fall of them, how the sights framed a world reduced to geometry and small intervals of time. Each shot was a syllable in a long, private language. Each hit marked a small, private oath, to be prepared, to be useful, to be steady. Sometimes, after the range closed and the lights were dimmed, she would walk a circuit of the base as if it were a map to be remembered. She liked the way the barracks smelled after rain, the way the mess hall light threw soft ovals on the pavement. She liked the quiet repairs that a man or woman could not measure in metals, but in reliability. An electrical box rewired cleanly, a cot mended so it wouldn't squeak, a spare part fashioned to fit like it had always belonged. These things, to her, were sacraments. And so the institution learned to value competence differently. Where before it had favored voices that demanded being heard, it learned to reward those who commanded with silence. Where before it had been quick to judge on the basis of story, it learned to set story aside and examine the work. The protagonist continued to teach the doctrine of action over noise, not by pronouncing it, but by living it. She was, in time, less a surprising story and more a standard. The consequences of that change were not immediate or trivial. There were savings in equipment, fewer preventable mishaps, and a modest uptick in morale, where people felt their work considered and their mistakes treated as lessons rather than weapons. Promotions began to account for demonstrable, verifiable skill in quieter areas: logistics, maintenance, mentorship. The narrative of competence broadened to include the unglamorous craftsmanship that kept the world functioning. And in private moments, when the protagonist allowed herself to reflect, she thought about the fragility of reputation and the sturdiness of actual work. She considered the men and women who had looked away before the president's visit, who had laughed and pointed and made themselves feel clever at the expense of another. She thought about the gatekeeper and his note tucked under the plaque. She thought about the lieutenant whose cadence had shifted. She thought about the recruit who had learned to move before speaking. Each of these was a stitch in the fabric of a slow, patient reweaving. On certain nights, when the wind lay low and the base settled into the kind of silence that is both restful and alert, the protagonist would find herself thinking of legacy in the specific way the authority had once framed it, the ways our actions alter what people expect of themselves after we are gone. It was a measure that had no immediate benefits in fame or fortune. It was not televised. It did not lend itself to sound bites, but it outlived both the teller and the told. The narrator, who had watched this arc like someone tracking seasons, might remark that the protagonist's legacy was not made of trophies, but of small, durable changes, a corrected protocol here, a more thoughtful drill instructor there, a habit of looking before judging. These things compound, like interest on an otherwise small principal sum. The compound interest of quiet competence, when given time and the right currency, yields a change in culture that is not easily undone. And so the story continued to unfold in its own ordinary ways. Trains of people arriving and leaving, recruits learning to lace boots properly, non-coms teaching the art of pointing without pointing, showing rather than telling. The protagonist remained at the center of this, not as an aggrandized hero, but as a steady presence whose actions continued to whisper a doctrine louder than any shouting could. That respect must be earned through action, that competence is quiet but decisive, that legacy is the sum of the small corrections you make to the way people expect each other to be. There were challenges ahead, new conflicts, new tests of character that would press against the cloth of this reformed culture. There would be mistakes and setbacks. Institutions are living things that heal slowly and sometimes scar. Yet the truth of the protagonist's influence persisted like a current beneath the surface, unseen but felt by anyone who ventured into the water. And as the nights lengthened into the long arc of service and the protagonist continued her slow, careful work, one truth revealed itself plainly. The kind of change that matters most is the kind that lasts when cameras leave and applause dies down. It is the change that molds practice into virtue and converts the glare of performance into the steady light of duty. For now, the plaque stood, the notes gathered, and the bass kept moving forward with an altered gait, one that favored observation over assumption, action over the applause that once substituted for action. The protagonist remained modest in her expectations, resolute in her craft, and quietly, insistently present. Her hands continued to tell a story that words could not wholly capture, a story of care, precision, and the stubborn belief that the work itself was the primary arbiter of worth. The narrative that had begun with a humiliating insult now moved into the subtler work of cultural realignment. That was where the real victory lay, not in a single dramatic vindication, but in the deliberate, repetitive, unglamorous labor of setting a new baseline for what competence looks like. And in those quiet measures, in the act of showing rather than declaring, the protagonist ensured that the world would be a little safer, a little saner, and a little more respectful of the small, essential truths that sustain lives long after headlines fade. She folded the last note into the pocket of her flight jacket and breathed, the air of the hangar carrying oil and rain and the faint, metallic tang of gunshot from distant ranges. The plaque on the wall caught light and threw it back like a promise. Around her, the bass moved with the steady, taciturn rhythm of people who had learned to measure days by tasks completed rather than applause won. She felt the weight of the moment, a small, sensible weight, not a crown, and let it settle. "We keep going," she said softly, more to the room than to anyone specifically. A corporal paused nearby, then nodded. "How do you keep from?" he started, then stopped, because words often collapsed against the kind of discipline he meant. She looked at him. Her hands were steady, palms dry, nails short from work. "Precision," she said. "Practice. The rest shakes out." Her voice was a tool, trimmed of flourish. It landed like a measure. Later that afternoon, the antagonist stood awkwardly by the coffee cart, eyes avoiding the plaque. He had practiced apology in his head in short, unstable fragments. When he finally spoke, his tone was thin, raw from pride pricked. I misjudged you," he said. The words had the shape of a surrender, small and brittle. She watched him, and in her face there was no triumph. Only an economy of expression, a slight tilt of the chin, an acknowledgement that settled the matter. "It's easier to learn than to admit," she said. He laughed, not unkindly. "Then teach me," he replied, and the request was as valuable as any medal. Night fell, and the base's lights glowed like constellations reversed. In the mess hall, a young recruit lifted his cup and said, almost reverently, "They told us about the Morgan line today." Conversation folded around that mentioned the way wind finds the seam between two buildings. Stories gathered, not as gossip, but as lessons. How to inspect a rifle quietly, how to check a map twice and still trust your instincts, how to deliver bad news without noise. She walked the perimeter later, gloved hands tucked into pockets, listening to the ground under her boots, soft, then compact, a sound that matched her own pulse. She thought about the people who would come after, the ones who would stand where she stood and choose to be methodical rather than loud. She imagined a classroom where arrogance melted under routine, where respect accrued through competence rather than ceremony. The image steadied her. A new plaque was suggested that evening, a small plaque in the armory, engraved only with a line, "Respect earned." It was enough. Years from now, a recruit would brush that metal and feel the cool moment when assumptions were corrected. The protagonist smiled, not public, but private, and walked back toward the lights. Her work continued, unseeming and sure. The bass exhaled around her. The change she had begun moved through the place like a current, invisible, persistent, true. For the first time in a long while, she slept without hearing the clamor of voices telling her who she was.